My brother had an affair with my fiancée, got her pregnant before my wedding, and my parents supported him over me. When we think of betrayal, our minds often wander to stories of deceitful friends, unfaithful partners, or perhaps even corrupt businesses. But what happens when the betrayal comes from those you love most deeply, the people you expect to stand by your side no matter what? This story begins with an unexpected twist, where loyalty and love clash with self-interest, exposing the limits of family bonds and how far people will go to preserve their own comfort. It's a story that questions the core of what family means and explores the consequences when that foundation crumbles. From a young age, I always had this sense that something was off in my family. I wasn't sure if it was just my overactive imagination or if there really was an imbalance. Growing up, my younger brother, Mike, seemed to have everything fall into place with effortless ease, while I felt like I was constantly struggling to keep up. My parents, Tom and Linda, made it no secret that they adored Mike. They made excuses for his mistakes and praised his every move. Meanwhile, my accomplishments were often overlooked or minimized, and every minor mistake seemed to invite a tidal wave of disappointment. It started small, Mike breaking a vase, and I would be blamed, Mike losing his temper, and I was grounded for setting him off. But over time, it became more apparent that this wasn't just typical sibling rivalry or favoritism. It was a dynamic that defined our family life, with Mike cast as the golden child and me as the scapegoat. I remember vividly how, at age 18, I managed to secure a partial scholarship to a decent college. It wasn't easy. I worked 2 jobs, stayed up late studying, and sacrificed social life to make it happen. The day I got the acceptance letter, my mom simply nodded and told me it was what I was supposed to do. When Mike announced his decision to attend community college 2 years later, my parents threw him a lavish party, complete with a new car. I was upset, but I told myself it didn't matter. I was leaving home, creating space between myself and the constant sense of inadequacy. Over the next few years, I worked hard to support myself through college, taking on part-time jobs, living cheaply, and staying focused on my studies. I had built a life for myself that was separate from my family, one that I could feel proud of. Mike, on the other hand, dropped out of community college after just 1 semester. My parents praised him for knowing himself and refusing to conform to societal expectations. They funded his string of failed business ventures, pouring their savings into one unsuccessful idea after another. And still, I tried to stay connected because after all, he was my brother. And that's when I met Sarah. Sarah was smart, funny, and compassionate, everything I had ever hoped to find in a partner. She was also beautiful, with a kind of radiance that made people gravitate towards her. We met through Mike, during one of his short-lived relationships. The moment we connected, it felt like magic. It was as if, for the first time, life was offering me something good, a happiness that felt real and untainted. Sarah and I started dating, and it wasn't long before we moved in together. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely loved. I believed that I could build a future, a family that would be different from the one I grew up in. A loving, supportive home, where each person mattered equally. But even then, my parents' disapproval loomed over us like a dark cloud. They didn't believe I deserved Sarah. My mom once asked what Sarah saw in me, and my dad, barely containing his disbelief, told me good luck keeping someone like that around. Mike, too, seemed to have an unusual interest in our relationship. He would constantly ask questions about Sarah, his curiosity veering into the unsettling territory at times. But I brushed it off. Maybe it was just him being protective, or perhaps he was happy to see me doing well for once. When Sarah and I got engaged, my parents' lukewarm response stung, but I was too happy to let it bother me much. I proposed to her on our 4th anniversary, just a quiet evening at home with dinner and a heartfelt speech. I had imagined this perfect future for us, filled with love, laughter, and possibly children. I believed we were in no rush, and we both agreed that we had our entire lives to plan the perfect wedding. It wasn't until months later that the signs started appearing, signs I ignored because I trusted Sarah. Signs I dismissed because I couldn't fathom my brother would be capable of such deceit. Sarah started staying out late more often. She became distant, glued to her phone, smiling at messages from a friend. I asked her about it once, and she laughed it off, calling me paranoid. I chose to believe her because I wanted to. It wasn't until one night, when she sat me down, tears streaming down her face, that my entire world came crashing down. She was pregnant, and the baby wasn't mine, it was Mike's. In that moment, the love I felt for her, the trust I had in my brother, the belief in a future I had imagined for myself, all of it was shattered into a million pieces. Sarah confessed that the affair had started around our engagement party. Mike had cornered her, told her she was making a mistake by marrying me. He preyed on her insecurities, offered her something he thought I couldn't give. They had been seeing each other for months, it wasn't a one-time mistake. It was deliberate, planned, and continued despite everything. I felt a kind of pain I never knew existed. I kicked Sarah out that night. I couldn't even look at her without feeling a combination of rage, betrayal, and heartbreak. I confronted Mike, and what followed was an infuriating attempt to justify his actions. He told me it just happened, that he was only trying to protect Sarah. My parents, when they found out, didn't react with shock or anger. Instead, they rallied behind Mike. Family comes first, they said. You need to forgive him and move on. They couldn't even acknowledge my pain, my heartbreak. Instead, they demanded that I support Sarah through the pregnancy and help Mike raise the child. As if their betrayal wasn't enough, they expected me to sacrifice whatever dignity I had left. I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. I was grieving not only my relationship but also the illusion I had held on to for so long, the belief that family would somehow always be there for me. I took time off work, unable to function, to face the reality of what had happened. Mike tried to reach out, alternating between apologies and accusations, while my parents bombarded me with calls demanding that I grow up. I decided to put legal boundaries between us, filing for a restraining order against Mike and cutting off contact with my parents. But even that didn't deter them. My family, unable to accept that I wanted distance, sent relatives to plead with me. Suddenly, aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years were calling to tell me how important family was, and how I needed to forgive. The legal battle that followed was exhausting. Mike violated the restraining order multiple times, showing up at my gym and even trying to confront me in public places. When I defended myself, he accused me of assault, dragging me into yet another courtroom battle. My parents stood by his side through it all, calling me the unstable one. They painted me as someone experiencing a mental breakdown, desperate to make themselves feel better by dismissing my pain. It was in the midst of all this chaos that I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep letting them drag me back into the toxic dynamics I had spent my whole life trying to escape. One night, after a particularly draining day, filled with court hearings and arguments, I made the decision to leave. I accepted a transfer to my company's Seattle headquarters. I needed a fresh start. A place where I wasn't the person whose brother betrayed him. Where I wasn't constantly reminded of the love I had lost and the family that had forsaken me. Packing up my life, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. It was hard to leave behind everything I had known, but I knew it was necessary if I ever wanted to find peace. The move wasn't easy, and settling into a new city felt daunting at first. But slowly, I started to find solace in the unfamiliarity. I built new routines, made new friends, and began to carve out a new identity, one that wasn't defined by the pain of betrayal. I took up hiking, spending weekends exploring the trails around Seattle. Finding comfort in nature, I started going to therapy, working through the emotions I had buried for so long. I even adopted a dog, a scruffy little mutt named Charlie who became my constant companion. Over time, I realized that what had happened, as devastating as it was, had also given me an opportunity to rebuild myself from the ground up. It allowed me to break free from the toxic expectations of my family and create a life that was entirely my own. I no longer had to measure my worth against Mike's or seek validation from parents who would never give it. I learned to find value in myself, to celebrate my own accomplishments, no matter how small. One day, as I was hiking up a particularly challenging trail, I met a woman named Claire. She had a smile that lit up her entire face, and a laugh that was infectious. We started talking, and before I knew it, we had spent hours just walking and sharing stories. She was different from Sarah, more grounded, more honest. As we started seeing each other, I was cautious at first, scared of opening myself up to the possibility of more pain. But Claire was patient, understanding, and willing to help me navigate the fears that lingered from my past. She once asked me if I had forgiven Mike and Sarah. At that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about them, it was about me. I didn't need to excuse what they did, nor did I need to let them back into my life. But I could let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. I could allow myself to move forward without the weight of that betrayal holding me back. Forgiveness, I learned, didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to live for myself instead of letting my past dictate my future. The lessons I learned through all of this were painful, but they were also necessary. I learned that family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by the people who stand by you, who lift you up, and who love you unconditionally. I learned that sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is to walk away, even if it means leaving everything you've known behind. And I learned that healing is a process, one that takes time, patience, and a willingness to face the darkest parts of yourself. To anyone who has faced betrayal, especially from those closest to you, I hope my story serves as a reminder that there is life beyond the pain. There is hope beyond the heartbreak, and there is a future waiting for you, one that is yours to create. Free from the shadows of those who have wronged you. Sometimes, the greatest act of strength is simply choosing to start over, to rebuild, and to find joy in the little things once again. Dad planned to marry his young girlfriend just weeks after my mom's death, threatening to kick me out. Ida for ruining his wedding? I could never have imagined that losing my mother would be just the beginning of one of the most tumultuous chapters of my life. It wasn't just about grief, but the realization that my father, who had been the pillar of my childhood, even if a twisted and shaky one, was about to shatter everything I thought I knew. And it began the moment I saw my father, standing there, with a triumphant smile plastered across his face, introducing a stranger as my new mother. The realization came quickly. My life was not going to get any easier after losing the one person who cared for me. My father's coldness wasn't new to me. For as long as I could remember, he had treated me with indifference, his focus elsewhere, never on family. Growing up, my mother always reassured me that he had once been different, someone with whom she had fallen in love, shared dreams, and built a family. But looking at his blank face, I wondered if any of that had ever been true. My mother, despite the constant pain of being mistreated and bearing the weight of his hostility, always tried to see the good in him. She used to tell me how, at one point, they had both been happy, a concept that seemed utterly foreign to me. Just weeks after my mother passed, after years of suffering from a relentless illness, my father brought home Melissa, a woman no older than me by a handful of years. She was introduced as my new mother. It was a cold winter morning, and I remember the emptiness of our house that day, the absence of warmth of my mother, made all the more unbearable by Melissa sitting at our kitchen table, sipping coffee casually as though she belonged there. The sting of betrayal cut through me sharply. My father's smile was cruel as he turned to me, proud and dismissive, almost daring me to challenge him. I wanted to shout, to cry, to tell him how wrong it all was. My mother's spirit still filled every corner of that house, and her empty chair at the kitchen table felt like a void we should have respected. Instead, my father looked at me as if my grief was an inconvenience, a speed bump on his path to a new life. He wanted me to accept Melissa, treat her as my mother. But I could not, I would not. And when I refused to comply, that's when the threats began. He told me I had no choice but to attend the wedding. My presence, he explained, would make everything appear normal to the outside world. People wouldn't judge him for marrying so soon after my mother's death if I stood beside him and smiled. I was to be his pawn, his shield from the whispers of his colleagues, and a tool to sanitize his public image. He threatened to kick me out and withhold my college fund if I refused to cooperate, a fund my mother had fought tooth and nail to save for me. And now he wanted to use it as leverage. I was trapped, a bird with clipped wings in a cage that seemed to grow smaller by the day. But my mother's voice echoed somewhere deep within me, telling me that I was stronger than this. I resolved that if I had to be part of this nightmare, I would do something to change it. And so, I decided to find anything, any secret, any dirt, that would give me the upper hand, something to prevent this insanity. One day, while my father and Melissa were out celebrating their impending marriage, I stumbled across his laptop, left on the coffee table. The screen was locked, but something urged me to try the password. To my surprise, It worked, Melissa's name followed by his birthday. It was strangely intimate, and a jarring realization that he had never cared enough about his family to make us a part of his passwords or his secrets. As I scoured through the contents of his laptop, I came across a second Facebook profile, one I had never seen before. It was his hidden account, used to keep in touch with people he had always claimed to be estranged from. For years, he had told us that he had no family, that they didn't get along. But here, in front of me, were pictures of my father with people who looked like they could be my relatives, smiling, laughing, enjoying holidays together. There were messages from his parents, my grandparents, whom I had never met. He had lied to my mother, to me, and to them. He had built a life where we didn't exist, and they had no idea I was even alive. It was in that moment that I knew what I had to do. I reached out to my grandparents, sending them pictures, messages, and my phone number, hoping they would believe me. I had no idea what kind of people they were, whether they would even care about me, but I had nothing left to lose. To my amazement, they responded. They were shocked, confused, and hurt by the realization that their son had lied to them for so many years. They had been told my mother and he had separated decades ago, that there was no family here. They had never approved of my mother, believing her to be a gold digger. But they had no idea that she had stayed, that they had a grandchild. And when they found out how my father had treated me, they were outraged. My grandparents decided to come. They wanted to meet me, to see for themselves the daughter they never knew existed, and they wanted to confront their son for his lies. Together, we decided to attend the wedding, not as honored guests, but as a reckoning. The wedding day came, and it was a modest ceremony in our backyard. Only a few colleagues and friends had been invited. My father, ever the actor, smiled as he stood at the altar with Melissa, seemingly without a care in the world. But just as the vows were about to begin, I slipped away and returned, this time with my grandparents by my side. As we walked down the aisle together, the look on my father's face was one of pure horror. Melissa looked confused, her eyes darting between us as if trying to piece together what was happening. I spoke clearly, my voice steady, as I told everyone present about the lies, the deceit, and the double life my father had been living. I told them how he had lied to his parents, how he had kept me hidden, and how he had planned to use me to make this marriage seem acceptable. I told them that I wanted nothing to do with him anymore, and that I was leaving with my grandparents, who had offered to take me in. The silence that followed was deafening. My father stood there, stunned, unable to speak. Melissa, too, seemed at a loss for words. And then, without another word, I turned and left with my grandparents. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of freedom, a sense that I was no longer bound by the lies and manipulation of my father. In the days that followed, my father tried to reach out. He called, he texted, he even showed up at the hotel where we were staying. But my grandparents stood by me, refusing to let him manipulate me any longer. They assured me that I would be taken care of, that I would be able to attend college, and that I would have the life my mother had always wanted for me. And for the first time, I believed it. Meeting my grandparents was like discovering a part of myself that I never knew existed. They were kind, supportive, and genuinely cared about me. They told me stories about my father, about the kind of person he had once been before he had lost his way. They told me about their hopes and dreams for him, and how heartbroken they were to see what he had become. And they told me that they were determined to make things right, for me. And for my mother. As I got to know them, I began to realize that family is not just about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who support you, and who love you unconditionally. My father had never been that for me, but my grandparents were, and for that, I was grateful. In the end, my father lost everything. Melissa left him, his colleagues distanced themselves, and he was left alone. He had built his life on lies, and when those lies were exposed, there was nothing left. He tried to blame me, to make me feel guilty for what had happened, but I refused to let him control me any longer. I had a new family now, one that loved me and wanted the best for me, and I was determined to make the most of the second chance I had been given. This story is a reminder that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, there is always hope for a better future. It takes courage to break free from toxic situations, but by doing so, we open ourselves up to the possibility of finding true happiness and belonging.